Welcome to A Peaceful Path, special education legal advocacy for families with children that have special needs.
Hello and welcome to A Peaceful Path, special education legal advocacy for families with children that have special needs. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and as always, I am joined by Michelle Becker. Michelle, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we're going to talk about 504 plan, talk about some of the early signs, how to start the process. Let's get at the very basic. Can you explain what a Section 504 plan is and how it differs from the individual education program or the IEP?
Yes, there is, in my mind, a big distinction. And going down the 504 path versus the IEP path is very different. So I guess the best way to start off with is a 504 plan originates out of the 1973 or the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So it's just Section 504 in a larger Disability Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So that's what you're talking about when you're talking about a Section 504 plan. And without getting too lawyer-like with respect to the language, if your kid has a disability that limits one or more life activities, they will likely qualify for a Section 504 plan at school. One of the most common disabilities would be ADHD, right? And basically what you need to have is a disability that impacts a kid's access to their education. That's very similar to the IEP. This is a little more of a complex conversation, so I'm going to try to go back and forth between the two, just to distinguish. I'll start, since we had a previous podcast on IEPs, Individualized Education Program. If the data supports needing an IEP because of the impact of ADHD, you can have an IEP that provides for, goals, supports, and services. And the data, there's certain assessment data that supports that determination, right? You have the disability, it's named something else in IEP land, other health impairment. And there's a definition of other health impairment that looks like ADHD, and then you get an IEP. Separate from that, there's a thing called a 504 plan that says, okay, you have ADHD and you need accommodations inside the classroom to basically support your ADHD. So you come to the school district and you say, here's my diagnosis. Can we have a 504 meeting? You don't go to an IEP team and say, here's my diagnosis. Can I have an IEP meeting? There is an assessment process to access IEPs. There is a medical diagnosis that is the on-ramp to 504s. And to me, that's distinction number one.
That I was going to say that okay. So if it's medically diagnosed, then you would probably go towards the 504. If you're not quite sure and you're trying to figure out what's going on and what the best way to do it is, you request the IEP. Is that do I have that right? Not really.
Kind of. We're splitting hairs, but let's split hairs.
Let's do it.
That's a whole different podcast, right? So basically, if you showed up to your school site and said, my kid has a diagnosis of ADHD, I want an IEP. They would say, okay, make a written request for an assessment. We'll do an assessment. We'll determine the need for an IEP based on the assessment data. And if it looks like you need an IEP, you'll be found eligible. We'll write goals, services, and give you supports. But it requires the pathway of the assessment, not a doctor's note. You have to go through the assessment process. You could say, look, Mike, and alternatively, let's just say that you didn't have a note, right? You're just like, my kid can't pay attention. They're climbing on the roof. Like, we found my kid on the roof of the school. They can't sit still. Oh my gosh, they're failing. That's enough to say, look, I think my kid needs an assessment. You go through the assessments and they say, you know what, this kid has ADHD-like behaviors. you get an IEP. You don't even need an ADHD diagnosis to get an IEP. You just need to have these ADHD like behaviors and adhere to the definition of what other health impairment is within the IEP land, and you'll get your IEP without a diagnosis. So it's the assessment process that takes you into IEP land. Conversely, you can't go to the school and say, I think my kid has ADHD, I need a 504 plan. You have to have basically a documented disability that's limiting one or more daily life activities to get the accommodations under 504. Okay. So there has to be a documented disability, and maybe the documented disability isn't a diagnosis. It might just be the school district has been documenting this for the last 3 years, that your kid is super hyper and we can't get them to sit still. It would seem as though that district would be on the hook for referring the kid. But you may have a kid who's super hyperactive that is climbing on rooftops and climbing trees, but is getting good grades.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really impacting their access to their education. But we need supports to like give this kid break times, give this kid jumping jack time, right? Do the things that'll help this kid blow off steam. That's where the accommodations come in, right? Which is basically what 504 plans look like. I've had some pretty extreme 504 plans that weren't like ADHD, that were more like sleeping disorders, where we needed an accommodation of a kid to show up at 1 o'clock in the afternoon because the sleeping disorder kept the kid up until 7 in the morning, right? So we need to shift the school times, right? So it's more about the documented disability that requires accommodations that moves you down the 504 plan path. Often what will happen is you'll go to the school and say, I have a diagnosis of ADHD. I think my kid needs an IEP. They'll say, let's do the assessment. They'll do the assessment and say, your kid doesn't qualify for an IEP. They're accessing their education. But what we can do is convene a 504 plan meeting, which is comprised of a different set of people. Let's do a 504 plan to support your kid in these areas of, inattention and hyperactivity. Your kid is still getting good grades, but they need support in the school.
Yeah.
And that's the distinction. They have to be able to, if they can access their education and they don't qualify for an IEP, maybe a 504 plan will address the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a very clear distinction, and they go down very separate paths.
Do schools ever push back on 504s? Because it sounds like they can push back sometimes after the assessment of an IEP. Do they push back on 504s too? Or is it, you got that note, you're in?
They can push back. I haven't experienced it, but they can. I mean, you have to go through an eligibility meeting. Does this kid qualify? And there's like a checklist. Is this happening? Is this happening? They go through the 504 plan eligibility, and it's not just a diagnosis. There's still pieces that need to be addressed. And once they're eligible, then there's whatever the list of accommodations is that the team and the parent who's part of the team agree will support the kid. It's not that hard to implement accommodations, right?
Yeah,
I think that teachers are accommodating all day long, every day.
Mm-hmm.
If Johnny needs to stop wiggling in his chair, she's probably got a rubber band to strap around the legs of the chair in her desk. She just takes the rubber band, sticks it around the legs of the chair, and before you know it, Johnny's chilling out.
Uh-huh.
So I think that teachers, just for sanity purposes, accommodate throughout their day.
I'm sure of it.
Yeah, kids got.
I have a 4-year-old, and I talked to the teacher, and she's they yeah, it's for their own sanity a lot of times,
Yes, yeah, it's totally true. So I do think that unless you got a bad teacher, and they're out there. I've had some teachers that I can't believe the disdain they have for the kids. Like, I've seen it.
Why are you
Yeah,
in this
exactly. It
order?
makes me very angry. But
Yeah,
there's a lot of really good, motivated teachers out there.
absolutely.
And when I'm in meetings, I kind of tend to kind of do a little pushback just to kind of see where any one person is at. And parents often ask me, like during a consultation, so does hiring you make my relationship worse? Does
With the
bringing
teacher?
you in wreck everything with the school or the teacher? And my honest answer is probably 9.9 out of 10 times I walk into an IEP meeting and there's certainly two sides of the table. By the end of that first IEP meeting, we're all on the same side,
Hmm.
on the side of the kid.
Yeah.
Because it's not about like, I'm not one of those lawyers who pounds my fist on the table and says, but the law says,
Hmm.
right? Because it's not that black and white. And in California, there was an audit done not that long ago over the last 10 years. Due process cases are decided in favor of school districts over 80% of the time.
Hmm.
So I think that the law is really on the parent's side before you file for due process. Now, honestly, there are cases that I just got to sue because I know I'm right. But chances are, when I'm right, those are the districts that back down and settle.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're not going to lose. Like they're going to spend a lot of money losing and then paying me. So, but you have to work the case. You have to
Hmm.
you have to work with the parents. You have to work with the IEP team. You have to get to know these IEP team members and know who's on the kid's side and who's not on the kid's side. And I think that generally by the end of that first meeting, we're all on the kid's side.
Yeah, which is what it should be.
Yeah, it should
Yeah.
be. But I think the relationship between the parents and the school and literally the lack of knowledge of the process on both sides. And also,
Yeah.
I'd say the flexibility of problem solving. I can't tell you how many districts I've said, oh, good, it's you. We were glad to see it was you who's the lawyer for the parent because we can solve the problem.
Right. We know we can get to the get to the finish line in a good way where everyone's happy.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's really because you know what? Lawsuits take years sometimes. I mean, continuations, appeals, like there's so many paths that can be taken. And the kid could be like 3 years down the road and it no longer has anything to do with the kid. It's like the larger landscape. I gotta say, I think in my practice, I'm one kid at a time. I mean, not one case, I handle a caseload, but I think that we change the world one case at a time. It
Hmm.
can't be these big legislative landslides because or not even legislative, but decision making landslides because there's very few out there and the few that are good for them, like right on. But I think that we can change kids' lives one day at a time. Like we can do this. It's possible. And I prefer that path.
Absolutely. So what does a strong and effective 504 plan look like?
Yeah, it depends. It really depends on what's going on with the kid, right? Because there is unlimited possibilities of what you could add to the 504 plan, right? Like for example, so I have this one wiggly kid and sensory input. I am convinced, and I'm just a lawyer. I'm not a doctor or medical professional at all, but occupational therapist. But I'm convinced that there's a lot of sensory going on with ADHD kids. And one of my very novel, I'll just say that in my caseload, it becomes a novel but really good way of hooking kids up is you got the wigglies and you don't have an aid and the kid needs a break because of the wigglies and just the overload. So it's not unusual for one of my accommodations for kids to, have the teacher send them to the front office with a loaded backpack of books. You got your sensory input, you got your break with the walk, you come back. That was all you needed to kind of
Mhm.
chill out and
Yep.
do the next thing. And it's not like, do you need a break? Or do you need to go take a walk? It's kind of like built into you get picked to take the walk with the big heavy bag of books. It's satisfied that sensory need if that's what the kid needs. And, that's one input, one accommodation that once an hour the kid drops the backpack off, brings back a folder. There's just
They do
always.
that at my son's school in preschool, like just automatically. If a kid's being disruptive or seems like he's jumping out of his skin, they'll just be like, hey, the teaching assistant needs to go down here. Why don't you walk with her? And they'll take the long way to this place and come back. And by the time he gets back, he's fine.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Sometimes you need to take him away from the situation.
exactly.
And, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or, maybe, there's a classroom A that takes the kid outside and does jumping jacks.
Right.
Or maybe, you have a kid that doesn't want to be different, right? So an accommodation might be, they get really anxious. Maybe anxiety is their thing and they have a 504 plan. Let's just say that they don't want to be asked a question. That's like the worst thing in the world. So what they do is they put their hand up, but their fist is closed, which means please don't ask me.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just, sir, maybe if it's time to take a break, you have a yellow index card and you just put up your yellow index card and say, I need a break. Or, just anything is possible. It's all depends on what the kid needs. And anxiety, mindfulness, maybe you have the zones of regulation as a visual on the kid's desk. And the teacher just has to, walk up to the kid's desk and say, how you doing? And the kid can point. I'm feeling really red right now. Okay. All right. Do you want to, whatever the accommodation is, do you want to go to the reading room? Maybe there's a little chair in the back, or maybe you have a wiggly that needs a bouncy chair. Mm-hmm. It could be a million things depending upon what is going on with the kid and what will keep the kid engaged and learning. Because, without that, like, you got to learn. And it's so dysregulating for a kid to kind of show up at their desk and not know what's going on. Okay, so now I gotta get myself back on track. It's so hard to do.
Yeah, so especially the younger kids.
Yeah. So the on-ramps and the off-ramps of the educational process has to be part of an accommodations plan. Mm-hmm. Because they got to get out or they got to come in and depending upon what their issue is, maybe it's goo because there's sensory stuff going on, or maybe there's speech, or maybe there's auditory processing. So they have the FM speaker system, how the teacher wears the microphone in the class. So there may be just accommodations. Now, what I can tell you is the accommodations in an IEP, like that is the 504 plan part of an IEP. It's like the accommodations in the IEP are generally, let's say we decide a kid needs an IEP or a kid no longer needs an IEP, but needs to go down to a 504 plan. It's like they're the same accommodations. You just make those work. That's that is addressing that aspect of not discriminating based on disability. Mm-hmm. So your accommodations in the IEP are how you're not discriminating.
Right. Fascinating stuff for sure, especially for anyone who's a parent. Thank you for tuning into A Peaceful Path, special education legal advocacy for families with children that have special needs. To connect with Michelle, visit michellebeckerlaw.com. And please like and subscribe to our channel. We've got lots of great content coming your way. Michelle, thanks again. Really appreciate all the time, all the insight, and as well as your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Kevin.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.